Good morning and welcome to Seattle Atheist Church. We call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. We try to do church without the cognitive dissonance. Without further ado, we'll have Stephen come on up and give your talk.
All right, well, let's get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Today, I'm going to be talking about Martha Nussbaum's book. It's called Upheavals of Thought. And Martha Nussbaum, if you're not familiar with her, she's a contemporary American philosopher. She's at the University of Chicago. She has a lot of different interests. So she has joint appointments in both the Department of Philosophy and also the law school at the same time. But she's also very involved in political science and in classical studies. And all this will become clear during the talk because she draws on a huge amount of research and literature and music and everything. So it's actually incredibly impressive how broad her reach is across all these different subject matters to build up the theory that we'll be talking about today. So she not only talks about contemporary philosophy, anthropology, and psychology, she also refers to Proust, Joyce, Bronte, and Mahler at the same time to be able to support her point. So a lot of stuff in there. So what I'm going to her book defends a particular theory of emotions, right? It's a theory of emotions. And I want to start just by explaining again why you should care about that, why a theory of emotions should be important to you, and I think important to the church. The idea behind a theory of emotions is if you want to understand, her project is to understand morality, right? To understand morality. And she believes that a theory of emotion is a necessary first step in getting to an overall theory of morality. She writes, "We'll have to grapple with the messy material of grief and love, anger and fear, and the role these tumultuous experiences play in thought about the good and the just." So it's important for morality, but the other part of it is it's also important to understand emotions, to understand how you can lead a good human life, right? So it's hard to understand how you can be happy unless you understand what happiness is, right? So having that basis in emotions is a starting point for figuring out, what is it to lead a good life? So that's why I'm interested in it. Now, just to clarify, she does not offer a moral theory in this book. She says, look, her theories of emotions can be used to support a variety of different moral theories, but it points in certain directions. So that's where she's starting with. Okay, so let's move on and talk about her particular theory of emotions. So she's defending a cognitive theory of emotions, and the way she sets it up is she contrasts it with a non-cognitive theory of emotions. Now, we've spent actually a lot of time over the last year talking about non-cognitive theories of emotions, but the most famous of those is the William James, the Lang theory of emotions, where what an emotion is, it's the beating of your heart, the sweating of your palms. It's the raw physical sensation of the emotion, right? When you're walking through the forest, you see a bear, you start running away in fear, your heart's beating, your palms are sweating. That perception of what's going on in your body, that is the emotion of fear. So I like to call that the feeling theory of emotions, because it all comes down to that basic feeling. That raw feeling is what we mean by a particular emotion. So I'm going to call that the feeling theory of emotion. That's the theory that she wants to protest, that she wants to offer an alternative to. She's offering something called a cognitive theory of emotion, because from her view, a emotion is, as most basic level, a judgment. For her, what an emotion is, it's a judgment about a belief. And so that's very different from the feeling theory of emotion. She's building her theory off of the Stoics, right? The Stoics actually built out an elaborate theory of emotions mainly to kill them, right? Stoics were anti-emotion. They tried to lead their life without being influenced them. But they built out an elaborate theory of emotions that she's building on top of to get to her evaluative theory of emotions. So emotions like, feeling fear, it's a judgment about a certain belief. But it's a special type of judgment. It's she calls it a eudaimonistic judgment, which is just a fancy way of saying that's a judgment about something that affects your own goals and your own flourishing, right? So things that are central to your life. Like if you see a rattlesnake in front of you, that's pretty central to your life right there, because that rattlesnake bites you, you're dead. Not much going to go on in terms of flourishing. It's a judgment about, those sorts of beliefs, how they impact you. So she believes that fear is a cognitive judgment that you're in danger, right? That's what fear is, as most basic level. Fear is your judgment that you're in danger. And she believes that there's 2 steps in fear. First, you have to entertain a belief that there's a rattlesnake in front of you. And then you have to actually assent to the belief. You have to accept the belief that, in fact, there is a rattlesnake in front of you. And that act of assenting to the belief is the state of fear. That is precisely what fear is. It's making that assent to the judgment that there's something dangerous in front of you. That's what fear is. All right, so she illustrates her theory of emotions with a personal story. This is something that happened to her in real life. And one of the interesting things of the book is she builds a lot from this story because it was a really intense personal experience for her. And one way to understand her book is what she's trying to do is analyze her experience of her mother's death. So a lot of the book is concerned with the emotion of grief, sadness and grief, and how she dealt with her mother's death. So the personal experience that she describes is, in 1992, she was in Dublin, Ireland, giving a talk. And it was actually a talk on this very subject, on theory of emotions. And while she was there, she got a phone call from Philadelphia where her mother was going through some sort of minor operation, and she had a major complication. So she got a call that her mother was, was seriously in risk of her life. So she got on a plane as quickly as she could. She found the nearest plane back. Wasn't until the next day. It's a long trip. This was back in 1992. Long trip back from Dublin. She arrived back in Philadelphia. While she was on the plane, she discusses how, her emotions wavered back and forth between fear and hope, right? Because she had, either the fear that her mother had died or the hope that she was still alive. And it wavered back and forth during that long trip across the Atlantic while she was waiting to get, back to the hospital where her mother was. So she landed, and then she, from the airport phone, she quickly discovered that her mother had in fact died during this trip to come back to the United States. So she rushed to the hospital, and her mother was in fact dead. So she writes of her experience when she comes back to the hospital. My mother has died. It strikes me, it appears to me, that a person of enormous value who was central in my life is there no longer. It seemed to me as if a nail from the world had entered my insides. It also felt as if life had suddenly a large rip or tear in it, a gaping hole. I saw as well her wonderful face, both as tremendously loved and as forever cut off from me. The appearance, in however many ways we picture it, has propositional content, or at least combination. It combines the thought of importance with the thought of loss. Its content is that this importance is lost. And as I have said, it is evaluative and eudaimonistic. It does not just assert Betty Craven is dead, that's the name of her mother. Central to the propositional content is my mother's enormous importance, both in herself and as an element in my life. So this summarizes her theory of emotions, right? For her, what it means to feel grief, which is what she's experiencing in this situation, is to judge that, a certain proposition is true. In this case, she's judging that someone who is central to her life is no longer, part of her life. And that has an effect on a core theme of her life. And so that's why she feels grief. Grief is the judgment, is that judgment that belief is true and assenting to that belief. She argues that emotion of grief that she experiences does not correspond to a bodily sensation. This isn't something that, has something to do, like, James would argue. She writes, there usually will be bodily sensations and changes of many sorts involved in grieving. But if we discovered that my blood pressure was quite low during this whole episode, or that my pulse rate never got above 60, we would not, I think, have the slightest reason to conclude that it was not really grieving. So what she's saying here is, unlike James, She doesn't believe that her perception of what's going on in her body has anything to do with the essential nature of grief. For her, the essential nature of grief has everything to do with the judgment that someone she truly values has been lost. And that's what grief is for her. Finally, she resists the idea, which, common language suggests, but she resists the idea that somehow that judgment led her to feel the feeling of grief, that somehow the judgment is a cause of grief. Because, again, she wants to claim that grief and the judgment are the same thing. So she writes, "It seems, moreover, that the adversary is wrong," that's James, basically, "to think of the judgment as an event that temporarily precedes the grieving, as at least some of the causal language suggests. When I grieve, I do not first of all coolly embrace the proposition, quote, 'my wonderful mother is dead,' and then is said about grieving. No, the real full recognition of the terrible event, as many times as I recognize it, is the upheaval. It is, as I described it, like putting a nail into your stomach." So again, the idea here is it's not the feeling, it's the judgment, right? That is, the judgment is what is the grief. All right, so that's her basic theory of emotions. That's the judgment, evaluative theory of emotions, cognitive. She supports it by referring to two contemporary psychological experiments. And so I just want to go over what those two experiments are. The two experiments are, we've already talked about this first one previously, the Schachter and Singer experiments having to do with giving these subjects epinephrine. Do you guys remember that? So what they did is they took a bunch of people, probably undergraduates, I don't know if they usually do it against undergraduates, but they brought in a bunch of students, they injected them with epinephrine without telling them. And of course that sped up their heart rate, it made them increase their respiration, did all that. And then what they did is they put them in one of two rooms. So in one room, there was a guy who was acting, euphoric. He was jumping around, throwing paper airplanes, making jokes, acting super happy. And the other room they put them in, there was another group they put in with a guy who was acting angry. He was complaining about the form they had to fill out and was acting super angry. And then they also they gave placebos to a bunch of students and also put them in the room. And what they discovered was that the students who had the epi injection, they actually experienced either anger stronger or euphoria stronger than the control subjects. And what this experiment is meant to show is that the actual content of your emotion isn't in your body. It's not in your feelings. The actual content of your emotion is how you judge what's going on in your body. So if you throw people into a room where everyone's happy, you'll make a judgment that your increased heart rate means, oh, I'm happy. This must be fun. I don't know. Let's throw some paper airplanes. If you throw someone into another room where someone's angry, then you'll interpret the increased heart rate as showing something about your anger level, and you'll believe that you're more angry. So that's now. There's been a lot of debate about this particular experiment, as you can imagine. So I'm not going to go into that, but this is one of the two experiments that she uses to support her evaluative version of emotion. The other experiment is Seligman's experiment. And this is another famous experiment in psychology. In the Seligman experiment, this is the learned helplessness. Have you guys heard about the learned helplessness? Some of you have. So the learned helplessness experiment, this is what Seligman did. He set up something called a shuttle box. And the idea of the shuttle box is it's this wooden box that's divided into two halves. And you put a dog in one half, and the dog can leap between the two halves of the shuttle box, right? You can jump over this little barrier in between it. And at the beginning of the experiment, what they do is they flash a light, and then they follow that flash of light by shocking the dog on whatever side it's on. And so the dog very quickly learns that when that light flashes on, better jump, right? Because otherwise it will get shocked. And so dogs quickly learn, oh, there's a light, better jump over the barrier. And that way in the future where they see the light, they don't get shocked. So, basic experiment. Okay, so you can teach a dog not to get shocked. That's great. But what Seligman did is he put a dog in the box, but he actually tied down the dog, and then he shocked the dog repeatedly. Now, there are ethical worries about this experiment, which I share with you. We're going to ignore that for a moment. But ignoring that, what they learned from this is, first, the dog that was tied down and couldn't escape the shock, first experience the dog had was fear, of course, right? And then the dog learned depression after that. Because as soon as the dog discovered that the dog had zero control over being able to escape the shock, well, what would you feel, right? You would feel depression because you're now in a state of learned helplessness. You've learned that there's nothing you can do to escape the situation. Then what they did is they took the dog, after it's been trained that it can't do anything, and they put it back in the normal shuttle box so that now it can see the light. And, a normal dog could learn to jump and be able to escape the shock. But now that this dog has learned that they can't do anything, even though they can now, they don't jump. They just sit there. They sit there depressed and they can't do anything about it. So the experimenters actually learned that they had to physically drag the dog over the barrier again. And over time, they're able to teach the dogs that you actually can escape when the light goes off and learn to jump the barrier. It's just that it takes a lot more work now. Now that the dog has learned that it's hopeless, it's hard to teach the dog optimism again. It's hard to get the dog to be optimistic and start learning to, leap the barrier again. So again, this is in support of the idea that emotion has a necessary evaluative component. The dog had to make the judgment that the situation was hopeless for it to feel the depression, for it to get into a depressive state. So that was the import of the experiment. Okay. All right. So now I want to talk about how she deals with two objections to this cognitive judgment-based theory of emotions. So let's start with animals and children. Okay, so one of the objections that people always bring up to cognitive theories of emotions are, well, what about children who don't speak language yet? Or what about animals who will never speak any language at all? Non-linguistic creatures. Are you saying they don't have emotions? That seems kind of crazy. I mean, a dog seems to have emotions. My daughter seems to have emotions. What's going on there? Well, the Stoics actually just bit the bullet and said, nope, children and animals, no emotions. If they can't express propositional contents, nothing's going on there. Yep, go ahead, it doesn't matter, you can do anything you want to a dog, it doesn't feel any emotions at all. So that's a pretty horrible place to go. And that's not where Martha Nussbaum is going with her theory. What she wants to say is she wants to distinguish between the idea of using language to represent cognition, in other words, using language to represent thought, versus the ability to have cognition itself. So she says, well, of course, children and animals have emotions. It's just that they can't express it in the way that humans do. And in fact, there's no reason to say, like in the experiment we were just talking about, the dog made a judgment. In fact, he was making complex cognitive judgments about his surroundings, about the fact that, hey, it's kind of useless to try to escape this shock. I can make these judgments, and the dog can even assent to certain judgments. So in the basic sense of cognition that she's talking about, children and animals can do that. So she's happy to extend it out, unlike the Stoics. She's able to say that, oh yeah, my theory also applies to all animals and children. Now, the other objection that people bring up to cognitive theories of emotions is music. And let me explain why this is such a strong objection. Music impacts people emotionally, right? You listen to a song, makes you feel happy, makes you feel sad, makes you feel whatever. The normal way we talk about this is we say it evokes an emotion in people, right? It causes the stirring of your heart or something to happen. That's why people enjoy listening to music, because it has an emotional effect on people. But if you have this cognitive theory of emotion, it seems difficult to be able to explain how you can have that effect, given that there's really not a lot of cognitive content going on in music. So how do you get from listening to music to experiencing emotion? So what she wants to say is language is just one way to represent cognition. In other words, thought. That music, you can also use music to represent cognition. And in fact, it's a pure form when it comes to the case of emotions. So she devotes an entire chapter to analyzing Mahler's, I don't speak German, so I'm going to mess this up, the Kindertotenlieder. I don't know, someone can correct me on that. I don't know, but anyway, so she spends a whole chapter, because what she wants to show in the chapter, she goes through, piece by piece, and she wants to explain what's going on emotionally in this song. So what I was going to do right now is I'm going to play a little bit of the song, just so that you can we can do a little bit of interpretation too. And let me pull it up here. 1 second. There we go. All right. So I'll go ahead and play it. All right, so quick, John, what's that about?
If sadness, it's a guy being sad.
Guy being sad. Okay, that sounds pretty good. Any other? What does it suggest to you? Yeah.
It feels kind of bittersweet.
Bittersweet.
Yeah.
Nice.
So it's
Okay.
not completely sad.
Yeah.
I was going to say morning. Maybe.
Morning. Yeah. Nice. Okay. Yeah.
Contemplating.
Contemplating. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely not a happy sound, right? It's not happy music. It's more. There's something about the way it works that it seems it seems sad and reflective. Here, I'll pull this up. Okay, so yes, I think on that level, absolutely, that you can talk about music, causing emotions, right? At the level of, how at that level, but realize that she wants to say something much more specific about the ability of music to convey emotions. Remember, her theory of emotions is emotion is a judgment. It's an evaluative judgment. It has propositional content. It has, more than just, sort of the stirring of the heart. It has to be about something. It's a proposition about something in the environment. Now, I have to tell you, I had a hard time honestly had a hard time believing a lot of her passages because she gets into such detail. She talks about when the glockenspiel comes in, what the glockenspiel means, and this is, rays of light and change of hope. It's like, that's what the glockenspiel means? But anyway, there's all these different passages in the music where she gets very fine-grained about it. Now, what she argues, and which might absolutely be true, is she says, look, it takes a great degree of sophistication to be able to appreciate music. I, Stephen Walther, do not have that background in music, so to expect for me to come along and find all the subtle, emotions being conveyed by the music, I don't know that language. And so she would say that I, can't interpret everything going on. And that may very well be true, but I also, I felt like she was cheating a little bit, because as you notice, there was there were actually lyrics going along with this music, because this music was actually set to poetry. It was actually written to accompany some poetry that was written out. So she knew the exact context of everything that was going on in the song. And so she had a lot of context around what it was about. It was about, you guys were all pretty close, it was about a grieving father. So it does have that thing, but it has a very specific, each part of it has a very specific meaning that she knows. She knew, she kind of cheated, I felt, because she knew that when she was analyzing the music. Okay, so I didn't find that particularly convincing, but we can talk more about that. What I want to do now is I want to move on to the conclusion. First, I want to say I'm super sympathetic to what Martha Nussbaum is trying to do. I mean, I think it's great. She has whole sections of her book where she goes into the nature of compassion and love, and I think that's super valuable stuff. I have a hard time believing that her judgment theory of emotions. I really do. And my main objection to her judgment theory of emotions is I don't think it captures what we mean by emotions. I think the James theory is much closer. And consider this. We talked before about the Jaak Panksepp. He's the neuroscientist at Washington State University. And he's done those experiments where he can do direct stimulation of the human brain, cause people to immediately feel anger or immediately feel sadness or fear just by stimulating the right neurons. And, that the weird thing about those experiments is when he does the stimulation of the neuron, someone says, I'm feeling angry. They say, well, I'm not feeling angry about anything in particular. I just feel angry, right? You've made me feel angry. I don't know what I feel angry about, but I feel angry. And when he does this on animals, the animals actually, they get ferocious. They start biting and trying to bite the experimenter. So the point here is that it's comprehensible. You know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about, having this experience of anger without it being a judgment about any particular thing. So at the conceptual level, at least, I don't think Martha Nussbaum's theory makes sense because we can make sense of emotions without putting them in the context of judgments. Another way of saying that is, let's say Microsoft came out with a new Xbox, extension that you put this little thing on, this little helmet, and they have these little buttons you push that make you feel sad or make you feel, fear or angry. Again, that's completely, what I'm saying isn't incomprehensible. It's not like I'm some sort of weird conceptual, thing I'm saying here. You understand what I'm talking about. So at a conceptual level, I think we understand that really what fear is or anger is the feeling, is not necessarily the judgment. So I think this opens up a larger issue with a lot of the emotion theories that we've talked about over the last year or so. I think the biggest problem with theories of emotions is they're often talking about very different things. And so I just want to end the talk by clarifying, I think there's 3 different senses of emotion. And I think the different theories are trying to address these different senses of emotions. And then they end up talking past one another because they're not actually tackling the same issues. So 3 different theories of emotions. I'm just going to focus on fear, just to keep things simple. And so I want to start by talking about something I'm going to call signal fear, signaling, a public signaling of your state. And we talked a long time ago about Darwin, right? And one of Darwin's books was The Expression of Emotions in Man and Animals, right? Darwin was working on the same project as Martha Nussbaum. He wanted to come up with a naturalistic theory of morality based off of human emotions. So he spent a lot of time on the London Zoo drawing, basically different animal expressions to try to come up with a catalog of all the possible animal expressions there are. So he wrote that book, and then Paul Ekman, you might know from the Lie to Me series, great series on television, but Paul Ekman, who extended Darwin's work and showed that there are 6 universal emotions that anyone from any culture can recognize automatically, the 6 emotions, which are, by the way, anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. So these are all expressed in the same way across different cultures. But the thing I want you to understand about this signal fear, about this type of emotion when you're describing it, it's all about the public display, right? These are expressions of emotions that we're focused on, not the feeling, not the behavior, the expression. That's what we're talking about here. That's what Darwin was drawing in the zoo. Consider like my dog Rover. When another dog walks in front of our house, he goes running toward the window. He starts barking furiously. He's angry. He gets really, really angry to warn the other dog to stay away, right? That this is his territory. Don't mess with me. This is Rover territory. The purpose of his anger is really purely to signal to other animals that, I'm a danger. Be careful around me. Then there's a second type of emotion, second way to understand emotion, that I'm just going to call qualia fear. So it's the brute sensation of the emotion. And that sense is like the what we're talking about with Jacques-Concept, that's the direct brain stimulation sense, where you have the experience of fear, that you have the direct experience of it. Now, qualia fear might be reducible to, if you're William James, you might say, well, qualia fear is just the sweaty palms and the fast heartbeat. If you're Martha Nussbaum, you might feel that qualia fear is just reducible into the judgment that there's a rattlesnake in front of me. Or it might not be reducible to anything at all. It might be just a primitive of human experience, like perceiving the color red or the color green. We might just have a pure sensation of fear or a pure sensation of grief that's not reducible to something else. I'm very open to that idea as well. And then finally, the last type of emotion, the last type of fear, I'm going to go ahead and just call it behavioral fear. And examples of that are like the roundworm, C. elegans. Remember C. elegans? One of the nice things about C. elegans is C. elegans spends its day, swimming through the earth. But C. elegans has a predator, right? There's a special type of fungi that can make the little hoops. And if C. elegans goes into it, it gets trapped and gets eaten up by the fungi. So C. elegans, if you tap it on its head, it'll actually reverse motors and move backwards. Now, the reason I love C. elegans is we understand that creature more than any other creature on Earth because it has a limited, it has 91 neurons. I think I'd have to look it up again. About 91 neurons, we've mapped all of them. We know all the connections between it. We know it down to a mechanistic level. Everything you can ever want to know about C. elegans. We know that it's very, very unlikely that C. elegans is having any experience of fear at all. It's just, where's that going to? Because we know when we tap it on its head, we can trace the neuron connections down to the motor neurons, which cause it to reverse engines. It's behaving in a fearful way, but I'm really, really doubtful that C. elegans is anything like yikes is going on in its head, because really there's no place to say yikes. It's just doing the behavior. Another example of that is, John likes to play Halo. When he's playing Halo and he's running over there with his, chasing the aliens go fleeing away in fear. I really don't think the artificial intelligent aliens in Halo are experiencing the real feeling of fear. They're just behaving in a fearful-like manner. And we use that language all the time, and we understand what we're talking about. So anyway, I think that Nussbaum has described only a single slice of the emotional pie. An emotion like grief is more than just the cognitive aspect. There's all those different aspects I talked about. Number one, grief has a signaling purpose. When people are grieving, it's a signal for other people to help you. Your downcast eyes and crying is a plea for help, right? That's one of the purposes of crying, is to, especially among children, is to say, hey, adults, we need some help here. So it does have an expressive public signaling purpose to it. There's also grief, and I think this is a central part of grief. It is painful. It is the nail through her stomach that she was talking about. It has an experience, and I think that's irreducible, that's part of your emotion of grief or fear, is the feeling that you're having when you're having that grief or fear. You can't just eliminate that into a judgment, or I'm not even sure you can eliminate that into sweaty palms or beating hearts. And then finally, grief changes your behavior, probably for adaptive reasons, right? When you're grieving, you normally lower your participation with other people in the community. You close into yourself. You distance yourself from others for a period of time. And that might be adaptive in a society for people to cut themselves off for a while. So it does have behavioral effects as well. So anyway, I'm going to stop here, and so that we have a chance to discuss. So why don't we go ahead and just circle up the chairs and we can talk about this.